My daughter stole my lakeside home, the one I built with my own two hands, and gave it to her husband's family. She thought I'd just walk away defeated. She didn't know that they wouldn't even survive the first week, or that they would soon be begging me to take it back. The house itself would make sure of that, because I had built it and I knew all its secrets. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of how I turned their dream into a nightmare, I'm curious, where are you all watching from? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments below. Let me know what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to it. The words still echo in my mind, as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. Dad, it's theirs now. You need to leave the keys. My own daughter, Jessica, stood in the center of the great room, the one with the vaulted ceiling made from Carolina pine I'd cured myself. Her arms were crossed, her chin held high, as if she were a judge delivering a sentence, and not a daughter shattering her father's heart. Beside her, leaning against the doorframe with a smirk that only unearned arrogance can buy, was her husband, Brian. He'd never held a hammer for more than 5 minutes in his life. Yet here he was, standing in my house like he owned the very ground under his feet. And now, I suppose he did. This house wasn't just a property on a deed. It was my masterpiece, my anchor to this world after my wife, Sarah, had passed. 40 years of sweat, calloused hands, and stubborn pride were soaked into its very foundation. I remembered working construction jobs during the day and taking on side work as a carpenter at night, all to pay for those massive picture windows that overlooked the lake. I'd spent an entire summer sanding the oak staircase by hand until it shone like honey in the afternoon sun, just the way Sarah had dreamed it would. She was the one who picked out the river stone for the fireplace. I can still see her eyes lighting up the moment she saw it, her hand in mine. "This is it, Frank," she'd whispered. "This is our forever." This place wasn't just wood and nails. It was our life, our history, our shared soul. "You're giving it to them?" I asked, my voice low, thick with a disbelief that felt like choking on dust. The them in question were Brian's parents, people I'd met maybe twice at holiday dinners. People who'd never sat by this fireplace, never planted a single rose in Sarah's garden, never helped me patch the roof after that brutal ice storm back in '09. "It's already done," Jessica said, finally breaking eye contact, her gaze falling to the floorboards I had laid myself. "We've talked about this. We need the space more than you do. You have that little apartment in town now. This will be a real family home, for us and for Brian's parents." I felt my jaw tighten so hard I heard a click in my ear. I forced my shoulders to relax, to not show them the tempest raging inside me. "All right," I said softly, "if that's what you want." I turned toward the door, my hand lingering for a heartbeat on the wooden frame, feeling the familiar grain beneath my palm. I was committing it to memory one last time. She thought that was the end of it. She thought the old man would just fade away into his sad little apartment. But what did my daughter, my own flesh and blood, really know about me? She was about to find out. I began to gather the few things I intended to take with me: a small box of Sarah's letters, my favorite fishing rod, and the worn leather armchair that had molded to my shape over thousands of evenings. Each item felt impossibly heavy, weighted down not by its physical mass, but by the memories clinging to it. As I was carefully wrapping Sarah's favorite porcelain bird in an old newspaper, Brian sauntered back into the room. He watched me for a moment, that same infuriating smirk plastered on his face. He gestured with his chin toward the mantelpiece above the fireplace, where a large framed photograph had held the place of honor for 20 years. It was a picture of me and Sarah, taken on the day we'd finished the main structure of the house. We were young, covered in sawdust, but beaming with a pure, unadulterated joy that felt like a lifetime ago. "We'll be taking that down, of course," he said, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. "Need to make room for our family photos." The words hit me like a physical blow. Taking down that picture wasn't just redecorating, it was an act of erasure. It was an attempt to wipe away the very history that gave this house its soul. I didn't respond, just continued my work, my silence a wall he couldn't seem to penetrate. Annoyed by my lack of reaction, he walked over to the table where I'd placed a small, open box. Inside was Sarah's old gardening journal, its pages filled with her delicate handwriting, detailing the planting seasons, her sketches of flower beds, her dreams for the landscape around our home. As he reached for a coaster, he accidentally knocked his half-full mug of coffee. Brown liquid sloshed over the side, pooling directly onto the open pages of Sarah's journal. The ink began to bleed immediately, her beautiful script blurring into an ugly, meaningless stain. He didn't even flinch. "Oops," he said, not a hint of remorse in his voice. He grabbed a napkin, dabbed lazily at the mess, and then just shrugged. Guess it was old anyway. That was it. That was the moment. The grief and shock that had paralyzed me instantly crystallized into something else, something cold, hard, and sharp. It was the quiet, methodical rage of a craftsman who sees a beautiful piece of work being desecrated. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about defending a legacy. This was about Sarah. So let me ask you all, you're in my shoes. Your child has not only taken your home, but has allowed her husband to disrespect the memory of your late wife right in front of you. What would you have done in that moment? What would be going through your head? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious.
I finished packing my box in silence. The air was thick with unspoken threats. He had made a critical mistake. He thought he was dealing with a frail old man lost in his memories. He didn't realize he had just given me the blueprint for his own personal nightmare. The silence in my new apartment was deafening. It was a sterile beige box on the third floor of a complex that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and loneliness. Jessica had called it practical and low maintenance. I called it a prison cell with a better view. The hum of the ancient refrigerator was the only sound, a hollow, monotonous drone that seemed to amplify the emptiness of the room, the emptiness in my life. That first night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the small kitchen table, the one that came with the furnished unit, and stared at my own faint reflection in the dark window. The city lights painted my hair silver, tracing the deep lines on my face, lines etched by years of labor, love, and now a profound loss I was only just beginning to process. This wasn't just grief for Sarah anymore. It was grief for the daughter I thought I knew. I thought of what Sarah would have said. She'd always been the practical one, but her practicality was laced with a fierce sense of justice. She wouldn't have stood for this. She would have fought. Not with anger, but with a cleverness that always left me in awe. And in the quiet of that soulless apartment, I felt her presence beside me, not as a ghost, but as an inspiration. This wasn't just a family drama. It had become a serious financial and emotional crisis for me. My retirement plan was built around that house, the security of owning it outright, the low cost of living. Now, I was facing rent payments and utility bills that would eat into my fixed income, causing a level of financial stress I hadn't experienced in decades. The theft of my home was also a theft of my peace of mind, my security for the future. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam warming my cold hands. Every sip brought back a memory of a morning in the sunroom, the smell of fresh coffee and Sarah's baking, the sound of birds and the towering oak trees. And with every memory, the quiet decision forming inside me grew harder, clearer, more resolute. They thought the house was just walls and floors, an asset on a balance sheet, something you could sign over like a used car. They were wrong. A house like that, a house built with love and intention, has a memory. It has a soul. And I knew its soul better than anyone. I started making a list. Not on paper, but in my head. the old wiring in the guest wing. I'd always meant to replace it, but never got around to it. It was safe, but temperamental. It couldn't handle a modern load of chargers, hair dryers, and televisions all at once. The antique locks on the interior doors, I'd salvaged them from an old hotel and restored them myself. They were beautiful, but each had its own personality, its own trick to opening smoothly. The small hidden panel behind the wine rack in the cellar, a panel that opened into a dark, dusty crawl space. The water heater. It was a newer model, but I'd installed a custom pressure valve myself to improve flow to the upstairs bathroom. A valve that could, with a simple turn, make the water pressure unpredictable. I still knew every inch of that house. I had its blueprints etched into my mind. I smiled into my tea, the first real smile in days. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a craftsman sharpening his tools, preparing for a delicate and precise job. They had taken my property, but my knowledge of it, that was something they could never own. They wanted my house? Fine, I would give it to them. But the house came with its own rules, its own personality, its own ghosts. And I was the only one who knew the rule book.
In the guest wing, where Brian's parents would be staying, I left the window shutters slightly ajar. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough for the coastal wind to slip in at night, making the old hinges groan and tap, like someone pacing slowly in the hallway. I went to the fuse box in the basement, a place they wouldn't think to look for months. I unscrewed the fuse for the kitchen lights, just enough so that it was barely making contact. It would work, for now. But any small power surge, like a toaster and a coffee maker running at the same time, would make it flicker and die. Every little adjustment was a thread I was weaving into a quiet, undeniable message. This was still my house, no matter whose name they scribbled on a legal document. My work was done, for now. This was just the first layer of their education. The real lesson was yet to come. Move-in day arrived on a crisp, sunny Saturday, the kind of perfect autumn day that can trick you into thinking everything is right with the world. I parked my truck on a side road with a clear view of the entrance, far enough away that I was just another vehicle in the landscape. I was a ghost at the feast, an invisible observer to the first act of my play. The caravan of vehicles rolled up right on time. Brian's gleaming silver SUV led the charge, followed by a bulky moving truck, and then an older beige sedan that could only belong to his parents. Doors opened, and the clear mountain air filled with their voices, loud, confident, the voices of conquerors, not guests. Jessica stepped out, wearing expensive sunglasses and a designer jacket, looking like she was arriving at a luxury rental she'd booked online, not a home stolen from her father. Brian, predictably, strode straight for the front door, without a single glance at the magnificent garden Sarah had poured her heart into. His parents, a mousy-looking couple, hung back, pointing at the upper windows and murmuring like tourists. I watched as Brian put his new key in the lock. I'd left it locked with the standard key, which worked, but the tiny adjustments I'd made to the latch meant that it now had just enough resistance to make you think you were forcing it. He pushed. Nothing. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with effort. The heavy door finally swung inward with a loud groan that echoed down the hall. A small, private smile touched my lips. Welcome home. They started carrying boxes in. From my vantage point, I saw Brian's father, a man with a perpetually confused look on his face, try to open the pantry door in the kitchen. It resisted. He jiggled the handle. He tried again. On the third try, the latch, which I had slightly misaligned, finally gave way. His frown was fleeting, but I caught it. It was the first tiny crack in their smug facade. The garden was next. I saw Jessica, trying to play the gracious hostess, lead Brian's mother toward the rose garden. Sarah's roses, I whispered to myself, a pang in my chest. But halfway down the stone path, she stopped, confused by the overgrown hedge blocking the route. "Oh," she said, her laugh a little awkward. "Guess we have to go the long way." They turned back, their expensive shoes sinking slightly into the muddy detour I had designed for them. I leaned back in my seat, the slow, warm satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed settling over me. This was the opening act. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could call sabotage or vandalism. No, this was far more insidious. It was just a series of whispers on their very first day. A suggestion that the house had its own will, its own memory, and it didn't bend to them. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting long shadows across the lake, lights started to flicker on inside. And then, just as I had predicted, the entire guest wing winked once, twice, and plunged into complete darkness. I could almost hear their cries of frustration. I knew exactly why it had happened. A single hairdryer plugged into an outlet that couldn't handle it. I started the engine of my truck and pulled away before they might notice the solitary figure parked at the roadside. They thought these were just glitches, the random quirks of an old house. They hadn't even begun to understand the house was actively fighting back. A few days of silence passed. I imagined them stumbling through the dark, wrestling with sticky doors, and wondering why the shower water had a mind of its own. I was content to let the house do its quiet work, to let the small annoyances build into a symphony of frustration. But then, my phone rang. It was a number I hadn't seen in a while, but one I knew by heart. It was my neighbor, Mr. Peterson. George Peterson and I went back 30 years. We'd taught our kids to fish on the same dock, we'd helped each other clear fallen trees after storms, and we'd shared countless beers on our respective porches, watching the sun set over the lake. He was a good man, a straight shooter, and his voice on the phone was troubled. "Frank, George here. You got a minute?" "Always got a minute for you, George. Everything all right?" There was a pause. "Well, that's what I'm calling about. Your new, tenants moved in?" He was being diplomatic. "I went over to say hello, bring a pie, like my Mary insists. Just wanted to be neighborly." I braced myself. "And how did that go, George?" "It was not great. Not great at all," he sighed. "The young fella, Brian, he barely opened the door, looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off a shoe. I told him who I was, that I was a friend of yours, and he just grunted. Your girl, Jessica, she just stood behind him and didn't say a word." My heart sank a little further. I was ashamed. "But that's not the half of it," George continued, his voice lowering. "The other day, I was out in my yard, and I overheard them talking on their porch. He was complaining about the house, loudly. Said it was a dilapidated money pit and that you'd let it go to ruin. And Frank, he said you were probably getting senile, and that's why you hadn't maintained it properly." A hot, white anger flared in my chest. To be robbed was one thing. To be insulted by a thief was another. But for them to tarnish my reputation, my life's work, to my own friends and neighbors, that was a declaration of war. "And Jessica?" I asked, my voice tight. She just agreed with him, Frank. Said something like, "I know, honey, we'll fix all of his mistakes." It broke my heart to hear it. This was worse than I thought. They weren't just moving in, they were trying to erase me, to paint me as a frail, incompetent old man to justify their own greed. But they had made another mistake. They underestimated my friends. "Thanks for telling me, George," I said, my voice steady despite the fury. "Of course, Frank. We're all on your side here. Just be careful." I hung up the phone, the anger inside me now forged into a diamond-hard resolve. This changed things. My subtle annoyances weren't enough. They needed a more direct lesson in respect. And thanks to George, I knew they were planning a big housewarming party that coming weekend, a party to show off their new house. Now I not only had a plan, I had an informant.
And what he told me next gave me the idea for my final masterpiece: the housewarming party. According to George, it was going to be a big affair. Brian was in finance, and he wanted to show off his new lakefront estate to his wealthy colleagues and clients. It was the perfect stage, a public stage, for a public humiliation. My plan needed to escalate. The time for subtle hints was over. It was time for the house to get loud. The night before the party, under the cover of a moonless sky, I made another pilgrimage. The chill in the air was sharper this time, a harbinger of the coming winter. I let myself in, moving with the silent, confident steps of a man who knows every creak and groan of the floorboards beneath him. I was no longer a ghost. I was the house's immune system, targeting an infection. My first stop was the attic. I climbed the rickety pull-down stairs into the dusty darkness, the air thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten time. There was a single loose beam up there, right above the main living room. It was perfectly safe, but I knew that if you shifted its supporting wedge just so, any strong vibration, like, say, the bass from a stereo system, would cause it to emit a slow, rhythmic thump. Thump. Thump against the ceiling plaster. It sounded exactly like heavy, deliberate footsteps. I made the adjustment. Next, I went to my old study. It was Sarah's favorite room, with a large bay window that she called her bird-watching theater. The latch on that window was tricky. If you didn't close it just right, a strong draft would whistle through a tiny gap in the frame. It wasn't a loud noise, but in a room full of people trying to make conversation, it would be a high-pitched, eerie, and deeply unsettling sound, like a kettle about to boil, but one you could never find. I jimmied the latch so it looked closed, but wasn't. My final stop was the plumbing. In the basement, behind the water heater, was a series of water pressure regulators I'd installed myself. I knew them like the back of my hand. With a few careful turns of a wrench, I altered the flow to the downstairs guest bathroom. Now, if someone flushed the toilet, the sink faucet would, for about 10 seconds, spit out a sputtering, gurgling stream of air before the water came. It was harmless, but deeply disconcerting. I stood in the center of the dark living room before I left, listening. The house was primed. It was a finely tuned instrument of psychological warfare, and I had just finished my tuning. Tomorrow, when the house was full of Brian's important guests, the concert would begin. A symphony of creaking floors, phantom footsteps, whistling winds, and sputtering sinks. Before I tell you what happened at that party, and trust me, it's better than anything you've seen in a movie, I need you to understand. This wasn't just about getting my house back. It was about defending the memory of my wife, Sarah. It was about proving that some things, like love and legacy, can't be stolen or signed away on a piece of paper. If you've ever loved someone that much, you know there's no line you wouldn't cross. George called me the morning after the party. He didn't even say hello. He just said, "Frank, you are a genius," and started laughing. It was a deep, rolling laugh of pure, unadulterated delight. He painted the picture for me, and it was more glorious than I could have imagined. The guests started arriving around sunset. Brian was in his element, playing the lord of the manor, a drink in his hand, laughing too loudly. Jessica, George said, looked strained, a forced smile plastered on her face. The first act began with the music. As soon as Brian turned on his expensive sound system, the bass began to vibrate through the floorboards. And right on cue, the slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump started from the ceiling above them. "What's that noise?" someone asked. Brian waved a dismissive hand. "It's old house, just settling." But the thumping didn't stop. It was a constant, unnerving beat underneath their conversation. Then, someone went to the study to make a phone call. A moment later, they came out looking pale. "There's a weird whistling in there. Sounds like a ghost." Laughter, but it was nervous. The atmosphere had begun to shift. The real chaos started at the guest bathroom. one of Brian's portly partners from his firm went in. A moment later, a loud yelp was heard, followed by the man storming out, his hands dripping. The sink just hissed at me. It spat air and then the water came out brown. The brown water was an unintended bonus. I'd probably stirred up some sediment in the pipes. Sometimes you just get lucky. The crown jewel of the evening, however, was the lighting. The party was in full swing, and Brian, in a moment of supreme arrogance, decided to show off the new exterior landscape lighting he had installed. He herded everyone out to the deck. "Watch this," he announced, and flipped a switch. The garden lights came on for a glorious second. And then, exactly as I'd planned, the overloaded kitchen circuit finally gave up. Not only did the exterior lights die, but the entire great room, kitchen, and deck were plunged into total, absolute darkness. There was a collective gasp, followed by a moment of stunned silence. And into that silence, Brian's voice, tight with fury and humiliation, cut through the dark. "It's that senile old man," he whisper-shouted, but it was loud enough for everyone, including George, to hear. "I swear to God, my father-in-law is sabotaging this house." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and absurd. The party was over. People started making excuses, fumbling for their phones to use as flashlights, and leaving in droves. George said he saw Jessica just standing in the dark, her face in her hands, completely defeated. I hung up the phone with George, a grim satisfaction settling over me. Brian had done exactly what I wanted. He had lost his composure. He had shown everyone his true colors. He had publicly declared war. And if you've made it this far with me on this journey, thank you. It means a lot to know you're listening. Just type the number 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. Because what comes next, well, Brian had just declared war, but he had no idea I was about to bring out the heavy artillery. A week after the disastrous party, the weather forecast handed me my next weapon. A massive autumn storm was rolling in off the Atlantic. They were predicting gale winds and torrential rain, the kind of storm that tests the bones of every house on the coast. For a normal family, it would be a time to hunker down and feel safe. For Jessica and Brian, it was going to be a night of terror.
The day before the storm hit, I drove out to the lake one last time. The sky was already a bruised, heavy gray, and the wind was beginning to whip a surface of the water into a frenzy. This visit required absolute precision. I was no longer just setting traps. I was choreographing a haunting. I let myself in, the house strangely silent, as if holding its breath. They were out, probably buying batteries and bottled water like everyone else. I went straight to the master bedroom, the room that had been mine and Sarah's, the room where my daughter now slept. The air felt wrong, foreign. I walked to the large cedar wardrobe that I had built for Sarah as a wedding anniversary gift. My fingers traced the familiar carving on the door panel. Inside, I didn't touch their clothes. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It was an old one, of me and Sarah, taken in this very room decades ago. We were laughing, her head on my shoulder. I didn't hide it. I placed it squarely in the middle of Jessica's pillow. Beside it, I laid a single, perfectly preserved dried rose from the bush Sarah had planted by the porch, a rose from her mother's garden, on her mother's side of the bed. Next, the cellar. Brian, according to George, had become obsessed with the wine collection I'd left behind, bragging about its value. I went down to the heavy oak door. Using a small, specialized tool, I disabled the interior latch from the outside, a security feature I had designed myself. Then I locked it with the skeleton key. Now it couldn't be opened from the inside or the out without the key, which was in my pocket. He wouldn't be checking on his precious wine during a storm. Finally, I went through the house and undid the latches on 2 key windows, one in the living room and one in the upstairs hallway. They would hold against a breeze, but a gale-force wind would blow them wide open with a crash.
As I drove away, the first drops of rain began to splatter against my windshield. The house behind me looked dark and foreboding against the churning sky. I had set the stage. Now, the storm would be my orchestra, and the house would sing its terrifying song. The wind would be its voice, the rain its tears, and the ghost of a memory would be waiting for them in their own bed. They had wanted the house, but they had no idea that tonight the house was coming for them. How do you think Jessica is going to react when she finds that photograph? I spent that night in my apartment, watching the storm rage outside my window, but my mind was miles away, inside the walls of my home. I didn't have to be there to see it. I could play the entire scene in my head, a movie directed by memory and imagination. I pictured the moment the first real gust of wind hit the house. The lights would flicker, a prelude to the main event. Then would come the sound, the low moan of the wind finding its way through the eaves, a sound I knew well, but to them, it would be the groan of a house in pain. Then, crash! The living room window I'd unlatched would be thrown open, slamming against the interior wall. Rain and leaves would spray into the room. I could see Brian yelling, cursing, fighting to close it against the wind, getting soaked in the process. He'd probably blame it on faulty construction. A few minutes later, bang! The upstairs window would follow suit, creating a wind tunnel through the hallway, causing doors to slam and a terrifying howl to echo through the house. Jessica would be huddled somewhere, her earlier confidence stripped away, replaced by a primal fear. I imagined them lying in bed later, the storm still rattling the house. The power would have gone out by now, plunging them into a deep, oppressive darkness. They would be listening to the unfamiliar sounds, every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window panes magnified into something sinister. The thump, thump, thump from the attic beam would have returned, a slow, steady heartbeat in the darkness above them. It would sound like someone was up there, waiting. And then, the moment of discovery. I pictured Jessica reaching for her pillow in the dark, her hand brushing against the cold glass of a picture frame. She'd grab her phone, her hands trembling as she turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam would illuminate the photograph. My face. Her mother's face. Laughing in this very room. And beside it, the dried rose. In that instant, all the strange occurrences of the past few weeks would snap into terrifying focus. The flickering lights, the strange noises, the plumbing, the party. It wasn't a faulty house. It wasn't bad luck. It was a message. She would realize they weren't alone in the house, and the ghost wasn't Sarah. It was me. The realization that I could get in, that I could walk through their private spaces at will, that I could be watching them at any moment, that would be a fear far greater than any supernatural haunting. It was the cold, terrifying fear of an enemy who holds all the keys, both literally and figuratively. The house had delivered its message. It had told them, in no uncertain terms, that they were trespassers, unwelcome. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of fear and paranoia I had just unleashed inside. The question was no longer if they would leave. The question was when. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a tense, unnerving silence. I waited. I knew the fallout from that night would be significant, and I didn't have to wait long. George called the next afternoon. "It's a madhouse over there, Frank," he said, his voice a mix of concern and amusement. "Brian's been stomping around a yard all morning. He tried to get into the cellar, yelling about his wine. He couldn't get the door open, of course. Started kicking it. Left a big dent in it. But that old oak door of yours didn't budge." A grim smile touched my lips. That door had been built to last. "He finally called a locksmith," George continued. "The kid took one look at that old lock of yours and said he'd have to drill it out, probably damage the door frame, and it would cost a fortune. Brian had a fit. Sent the kid packing." This was perfect. Brian, a man who believed money could solve everything, was being defeated by craftsmanship he couldn't comprehend and a problem he couldn't just throw money at.
He was trying to fight the house on his terms with brute force and cash. He was losing badly. Jessica, on the other hand, was a different story. I haven't seen her outside at all, George said. The curtains in the master bedroom have been drawn all day. She was hiding. She was processing the message I had left her on the pillow. The photograph wasn't just a discovery, it was an accusation. It was proof of my presence, a violation of her sanctuary. She was now living with the knowledge that the walls had eyes, and those eyes were mine. The psychological toll of that would be immense, far more damaging than a broken lock or a dented door. Her feeling of safety, the one thing a home is supposed to provide, was gone.
The breaking point came 2 days later. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Jessica. I let it ring 3 times before answering, my voice calm and neutral. Hello? Dad? Her voice was barely a whisper. It was stripped of all its previous confidence, all its cold authority. It was the voice of a scared child. Dad, we need to talk. I could hear Brian yelling something in the background, but she ignored him. The house, Dad, she stammered, and then she started to cry. Not loud sobs, but the quiet, hitching breaths of someone utterly broken. It's the house. It doesn't want us here. Nothing works right. There are noises. It feels like, she trailed off, her voice cracking. It feels like Mom's still here and she's angry at me. I let the silence sit for a moment, her words hanging in the air. She had misinterpreted the ghost, but the effect was the same. The house had channeled the memory of her mother's love and my own silent fury into something she could understand. Disapproval. Guilt. It's not an angry house, Jessica, I said softly, my voice devoid of triumph. It's just a house that needs to be understood. It was built with love. Maybe it can tell when that's missing. Another choked sob from her end. Can we meet, please? The war was over. I had won. She came to my apartment that evening. When I opened the door, I barely recognized her. The confident, immaculately dressed woman who kicked me out of my home was gone. In her place was a pale, exhausted-looking person with dark circles under her eyes, her expensive jacket thrown carelessly over a rumpled sweater. Brian was not with her. She had come alone. She sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had plotted my campaign, and wrapped her trembling hands around the mug of tea I gave her. For a long time, she just stared into the mug, as if the answers were swirling in the steam. We can't live there, Dad, she finally said, her voice flat. It's impossible. It's not just broken things. It's a feeling. The doors, the wiring, the windows, nothing works right unless you know its exact trick. Brian's parents are miserable. They think the place is haunted. Brian thinks you're a vindictive old man who's lost his mind. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. But I know what it is. It's you, and it's Mom. She reached into her purse and pulled out the small frame photograph I had left on her pillow. She slid it across the table towards me. We found this after the storm, on my pillow. Her voice broke. I think we were wrong, Dad. So wrong. I picked up the picture, my thumb brushing over Sarah's smiling face. I didn't smile back. I looked my daughter in the eye, my expression calm and steady, letting the full weight of her actions settle upon her. That house was never yours to give away, Jessica, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You can't just sign a piece of paper and change who a place belongs to. That house is a living thing. It has 40 years of my life in it. It has all the years I had with your mother in it. It remembers birthdays and Christmases and summer storms. It remembers you as a little girl setting the table for pretend dinner parties. Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked. I know,
she whispered. "I was so stupid. Brian, he was so convincing, talking about assets and investments and how we needed to secure our future. I let him talk me into it. I let greed make me forget what that place really was." "It wasn't just greed, Jessica. It was a betrayal," I corrected her gently. "You didn't just take a house. You tried to erase a history. Your mother's history." She finally broke down completely, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs of regret and shame. I didn't comfort her. This was a reckoning she needed to face on her own. The house had already passed its judgment. Now it was her turn. "What do you want us to do?" she asked through her tears, looking up at me like a child expecting punishment. I pushed the photograph back towards her. I said, "I want you to remember what you did. And then I want you to give me back my keys." By the end of that week, a moving truck was parked in my driveway for the second time in a month. This time, however, it was taking things away. I watched from the window of my apartment as they loaded up their boxes, their furniture, their brief, unhappy chapter in my home's long history. There was no loud confidence this time, just the quiet, efficient work of movers and the heavy silence of defeat. Brian avoided my gaze, his face a mask of sullen anger. Jessica just looked tired. She brought the keys to me herself that afternoon. She placed them on my kitchen table, a complete set this time. There was no more apologies left to be said, no more tears left to be shed. There was just a quiet, profound understanding between us. She had learned a lesson that no amount of money or legal maneuvering could ever teach. The next morning, I drove home. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I could feel the difference. The air itself felt lighter, clearer. The house seemed to be breathing a sigh of relief. I walked up the main stone path, now clear and unobstructed, and slid my old key into the lock. The door swung open smoothly, without a groan, as if welcoming me back. Inside, the scent of lavender seemed stronger, a gentle embrace. I spent the rest of the day in a quiet, satisfying ritual. I went from room to room, undoing my work. I tightened the fuse in the kitchen. I adjusted the pressure valve on the water heater. I latched the windows properly, silencing the whistle and the groan. I went to the cellar and unlocked the heavy oak door, and even found a bit of wood filler and carefully repaired the dent Brian had left in his tantrum. I was healing my house, and in doing so, I was healing a part of myself. Each fixed latch and tightened screw was an act of reclamation, a quiet declaration of my return. Later that afternoon, George Peterson came over, a six-pack of beer in his hand. He didn't say much. He just clapped me on the shoulder, and we sat on the porch, my porch, in our familiar chairs. We watched the sun set over the lake, painting the water in hues of orange and purple. The silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful, filled with the comfortable rhythm of a world set right again. My victory wasn't in kicking them out. It wasn't in their misery or their humiliation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My victory was quiet, and it was absolute. It was in the simple, undeniable truth that they were never truly a part of the house because they never respected its spirit. It was in the silent, sturdy presence of the home around me, a home that had fought for me as much as I had fought for it.
The villa was mine. It always had been, and it always would be. The papers in some county clerk's office had finally caught up with the truth. In the weeks that followed, the house and I settled back into our old rhythm. The mornings were quiet, filled with the scent of coffee and the sound of birds by the lake. The afternoons were for tinkering in my workshop or tending to Sarah's garden, which had been neglected but was not beyond saving. The evenings were for sitting on the porch, watching the stars come out, feeling the steady, reassuring presence of the home that held my entire life within its walls. My relationship with Jessica is complicated. She calls and we talk. The conversations are strained, careful. She's trying to rebuild a bridge she burned to the ground. I don't know if it can ever be fully rebuilt, but for the memory of her mother, I am willing to let her try. Brian is no longer in the picture. Their marriage, built on a foundation of greed and ambition, crumbled under the weight of their failure. I take no pleasure in that, but I am not surprised. A structure with a weak foundation is bound to collapse. What this whole ordeal taught me is something profound about the meaning of home. A home is not an asset. It's not an investment to be flipped or a line item on a spreadsheet. It is a sanctuary. It is the keeper of our stories, the silent witness to our joys and our sorrows. It's the place where we are our most authentic selves. You can't buy that. You can't steal that. You have to earn it. You earn it with love, with respect, with labor, and with time. They tried to take my house, but they couldn't take my home, because my home wasn't just in the wood and stone, it was in the memories, in the legacy of the love Sarah and I shared, and in the very soul of the place. This was my battle, but I know so many of you have faced your own, whether it's over a house, a family business, or just a matter of principle. Have you ever had to stand up for something that was rightfully yours? Something that paper and laws couldn't truly define? Something money can't buy? Share your story in the comments below. Let's talk about it. Your story matters, and it deserves to be heard. And if my story resonated with you, if you believe in fighting for what's right, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice, one way or another, being served. Thank you for listening.